My ex-husband loved to win. It didn't matter what it was. Arguments, card games, even who got the last word at the dinner table. Winning wasn't just a habit for him. It was an obsession. And when our marriage crumbled, he treated the divorce like the biggest game of his life. He strutted into the courtroom in his tailored navy suit, smirking like he'd already secured the trophy. He shook hands with his expensive lawyer, winked at his friends in the gallery, and barely glanced at me sitting quietly on my side of the aisle. In his mind, the outcome was already decided. And for a while it seemed like he was right. Before I go any further, let me ask you this. Have you ever watched someone celebrate too early, convinced they've beaten you while you secretly knew the story wasn't over? If you have, stick with me. You'll understand exactly why I did what I did. Don't forget to like this story, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because my ex-husband thought he had the upper hand. He thought he'd won. He had no idea I was already planning the ultimate reversal. The divorce dragged on for months. He fought viciously over assets, twisting the knife every chance he got. The house we bought together. He made sure it went to him. The vacation home we once dreamed of retiring in? Snatched it up with a grin. My car? He even argued about that, laughing as his lawyer painted me as unreliable and incapable of maintaining financial independence. But the real prize, the one he gloated over, was the company. When we married, it had been just an idea. A startup built from our shared dreams. I poured late nights, weekends, and countless sacrifices into helping him grow it. I handled the finances when we couldn't afford staff. I worked behind the scenes, quietly fueling his vision. But in the eyes of the court, it was his. Because the paperwork, always meticulously controlled by him, had placed the company in his name. When the judge ruled it belonged solely to him, he leaned back in his chair, smirked, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Better luck next time. I walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a box of files, a hollow bank account, and the bitter taste of humiliation on my tongue. Friends hugged me, told me to move on, to start fresh, to forget about him. But forgetting was never an option. Not because of the money. Not because of the house or the cars. But because of the way he looked at me that day. Like I was beaten. Like I was finished. Like he'd won forever. That look branded itself into me. And it sparked something I hadn't felt in years. Determination. At first I tried to rebuild quietly. I found a modest apartment, worked temporary jobs, and stayed under the radar. From the outside it must have looked like defeat. I was the discarded ex-wife, struggling to keep her head above water. And he thrived on that narrative. Every chance he got, he rubbed it in. He posted photos on social media of his success. New cars. Lavish vacations. Lavish dinners with his employees where he toasted himself as a self-made man. At one point he even captioned a picture. Some people are born winners, some are just spectators. I didn't comment. I didn't retaliate. But every post, every gloating word, only fueled me further. Because while he was busy celebrating, I was busy watching. And planning. The first crack in his armor came at a charity gala 6 months after the divorce. He was there, of course, strutting through the ballroom like a peacock. I stayed in the shadows, sipping champagne unnoticed. But I noticed him. I noticed the way he cornered investors with desperate charm, the way he brushed off questions about profit margins with vague promises. I noticed the flicker in his eyes when a rival mentioned market competition. And I noticed the investors who drifted away unimpressed. That was the night I realized something vital. His company wasn't as untouchable as he wanted everyone to believe. So I did what he least expected. I started learning. I enrolled in business courses, studied finance, strategy, and corporate law late into the night. I devoured books about hostile takeovers, mergers, and acquisitions. I networked quietly, meeting people who had been burned by his arrogance. Former employees, rivals, even silent partners who felt sidelined. Piece by piece I gathered information. And with each connection, each lesson, each whisper of discontent, a plan began to take shape. One that would turn his smug little world upside down. By the 1-year anniversary of our divorce, he was on top of the world. Or at least that's what he wanted everyone to believe. He threw a party at the company headquarters, complete with fireworks and champagne towers. Photos of him holding a glass aloft, grinning like a king, flooded social media. And somewhere in the comments someone tagged me. Bet she regrets ever letting him go. I laughed when I read it. Because what he didn't know, was that while he was busy celebrating, I had already started buying. Not the company outright. Not yet. But shares. Quietly. Strategically. Through friends, through third parties, through investment groups that had no visible link to me. He thought I was gone. But I was already inside his walls. And soon, very soon, he'd realize the game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When you lose everything, the world expects you to break. And for a while I did. I remember those first few months after the divorce. Sitting alone in my tiny one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint, staring at bills stacked on the counter, wondering how I was supposed to start over when the person I had trusted most had taken everything from me. But here's the thing about being pushed to rock bottom. Once you're there, you stop being afraid of falling. And that's where strength begins. I started small. Temp jobs that barely paid the rent, odd gigs that kept food on the table. I walked to save on bus fare, skipped luxuries like coffee shops and movies, and learned to stretch every dollar. From the outside it looked like failure. My ex-husband must have laughed if he ever bothered to glance in my direction. He, with his glass office and designer suits, probably imagined me sulking in defeat. But every sacrifice I made was an investment. Not in him. Not in revenge. In myself. At night, when the city quieted and the loneliness pressed in, I opened my laptop and studied. Finance. Corporate strategy. Business law. Words that had once intimidated me now became my armor. The irony wasn't lost on me. While we were married, I had begged him to let me be more involved in the company. Teach me, I had said, I want to understand. He had always smirked, patted my hand and said, don't worry about it. It's too complicated for you. Now those very lessons, the ones he had denied me, became the foundation of my plan. I didn't just study though. I listened. One of the blessings of being underestimated is that people talk around you. At networking events I slipped into quietly, executives let their guards down. At cafes near the financial district, I overheard mid-level managers vent about their bosses. I learned the language, the shortcuts, the cracks in the armor of people like my ex. And I discovered something crucial. Arrogance is loud, but discontent whispers. And his company had plenty of whispers. The first time I met a former employee of his, it was almost by accident. A young woman named Erica, sharp-eyed and exhausted, sat across from me at a networking mixer. We exchanged pleasantries until she realized I was his ex-wife. God, I'm sorry, she blurted out. I should have recognized you. I worked for him for 2 years. Her laugh was bitter. You have no idea what that man's like in the office. Oh, I said, sipping my drink. I might have some idea. We talked for hours. She told me about his temper, his short-sighted decisions, the way he dismissed anyone who disagreed with him. She wasn't the last. In fact, once people realized I wasn't there to defend him, the stories poured out. And with every story my confidence grew. He hadn't changed. The same arrogance that had destroyed our marriage was now eroding his empire. All I had to do was wait for the cracks to widen. Of course, waiting wasn't enough. So I worked. By day I earned just enough to get by. By night I sharpened my skills. And slowly opportunities began to appear. A local entrepreneur needed someone to manage her books. I volunteered, eager for the experience. A small nonprofit needed help organizing their budget. I stepped in free of charge in exchange for a reference. Bit by bit, I built a resume that had nothing to do with my ex-husband and everything to do with me. The more I learned, the more doors opened. Within a year, I had a steady job at a consulting firm. Not glamorous, but it gave me access to the world my ex thought was his alone. Boardrooms. Strategy meetings. Numbers that told stories if he knew how to read them. And I was learning to read them fluently. Meanwhile, my ex was busy being himself. He flaunted his wealth on social media, posted smug captions about winning, and surrounded himself with sycophants who laughed at his jokes a little too loudly. He spent lavishly, new cars, new properties, expensive vacations. He treated the company like his personal trophy, ignoring the quiet discontent of the people actually keeping it afloat. And he didn't notice the woman in the background, building her strength one piece at a time. The turning point came the day I stumbled upon a news article. His company, once hailed as unstoppable, had reported a weaker than expected quarter. Stockholders grumbled. Analysts questioned his leadership. And buried in the report was one small detail. Shares were quietly changing hands. My heart raced as I read those words. Because I knew exactly what that meant. The empire he had gloated over wasn't as solid as he believed. And if I played my cards right, I could slip inside before he ever realized I was there. That night, as I sat by my window with city lights flickering outside, I thought about everything I had lost. The house. Her. The company I had helped build. And then I thought about everything I had gained. Knowledge. Strength. Independence. Most importantly, patience. Because revenge isn't about striking fast. It's about striking last. And while my ex-husband was busy celebrating his so-called victory, I was already building the foundation of mine. The first share I bought felt like a secret victory. It wasn't much, a tiny fraction of stock, barely enough to matter in the grand scheme of things. But when I clicked confirm purchase on my laptop late one night, my hands trembling, it felt like I was planting a flag in enemy territory. I wasn't just his ex-wife anymore. I was his shadow. At first it was slow. I bought what I could afford, one sliver at a time. Sometimes a handful of shares, sometimes just one. Each time I did, I thought about him, sitting smugly in his leather chair, convinced he was untouchable. He had no idea I was inside his walls, brick by brick, stone by stone. But I also knew patience was everything. If I rushed, he'd notice. If I moved too boldly, he'd see my hand. So I let others play the obvious games while I worked quietly in the background. The key was connections. Through my consulting job, I met investors who had dabbled in his company. Many weren't impressed. Some were tired of his arrogance. Others were simply looking for an exit. And when they sold, I was ready. Not in my own name, of course. That would have been reckless. Instead, I created a web of discreet holding accounts, all perfectly legal, all untraceable to me unless you knew where to look. A friend of a friend, a cousin of a colleague, small firms eager to partner. Piece by piece, my presence grew. By the time I held 1%, I knew I had crossed a line. I wasn't just playing anymore. I was competing. Meanwhile, my ex was too busy celebrating to notice. Every quarter, he threw a party to thank his team. But the parties were more about him. Endless champagne, rented yachts, influencers snapping photos beside him like he was royalty. I watched the images trickle onto social media, each one dripping with arrogance. And I smiled. Because while he was busy curating his image, I was curating his downfall. The deeper I moved into the corporate world, the more allies I found. Some were small investors tired of being ignored. Some were employees, desperate for leadership that actually listened. And some were rivals. Other business owners who had lost deals because of his ego. They didn't know me as his ex-wife. They knew me as a sharp, driven woman who asked the right questions and followed through. And slowly they began to trust me. That trust was power. 2 years after the divorce, I had quietly built a network of support that stretched further than I ever imagined. My consulting work had blossomed into partnerships. My savings had grown. And with it so had my shares. I own nearly 5%. 5% doesn't sound like much, but in a fractured company, it was enough to get noticed. And finally, it was time to step out of the shadows, just a little. The opportunity came during a shareholder meeting. I sat near the back, blending in with the suits and ties. He was at the front, strutting as usual, rattling off inflated numbers, glossing over the weaker quarter. When the floor opened for questions, I stood. His eyes flicked toward me, and for a split second, I saw something he hadn't shown in years. "Madeline," he said, voice tight. "What are you doing here?" I smiled calmly. "I'm here as a shareholder." Whispers rippled through the room. He blinked, recovered quickly, and smirked. "Shareholder? What, half a share? A token?" I didn't flinch. 5%. The silence that followed was delicious. He laughed it off, of course, brushing it aside as a joke. "Well, I suppose anyone can buy these days." But I saw it in his eyes. That flicker of doubt. That edge of panic. He knew I wasn't finished. And he was right. From that moment he began watching me. His lawyer sent inquiries. His CFO tried to track my holdings. But my accounts were airtight, my network invisible. Every time they tried to corner me, they came up empty-handed. Meanwhile, I kept buying. Slowly. Quietly. Patiently. Every time he slipped, every time the market wavered, I was there. and soon the cracks in his empire became too wide to ignore. It was a former board member who delivered the final piece of the puzzle. Over lunch one afternoon, he leaned in and said, "You know, Madeline, if you want to take him down, you don't just need shares. You need allies in the room." I sipped my coffee. "And where might I find those?" He smiled. "Oh, they'll find you. Everyone's tired of him. They're just waiting for someone to lead." And that's when I realized I wasn't just buying shares. I was buying trust. I was buying power. And soon I would buy the one thing he valued more than anything else: his company. That night I stood at my window, city lights flickering like stars, and whispered the words I had been waiting to say for years. "You thought you won." I smiled. "You haven't even seen me play." Arrogance is the most expensive currency. My ex-husband spent it like water. For a while it looked like he could afford it. The company was still making money, still signing contracts, still putting out press releases that painted him as a visionary. He thrived on the spotlight, shaking hands at events, bragging to journalists about his genius. But arrogance blinds people. And it was only a matter of time before his blindness became my opportunity. The cracks widened slowly at first. Employees whispered about missed pay raises. Mid-level managers complained about unrealistic deadlines. Competitors began circling contracts he thought were locked. The company's once sterling reputation started to tarnish, one disgruntled client at a time. But he didn't see it. Or rather, he refused to. Every time someone questioned him, he doubled down. Every warning was dismissed. Every criticism was spun as jealousy. And while he drowned in his ego, I was quietly watching. Waiting. Collecting. One of my greatest weapons was his lifestyle. He had always needed to show off. Lavish vacations, cars that cost more than some people's homes, designer watches lined up like trophies. When we were married, I used to beg him to save, to think long-term. He would laugh and say, "Winners don't worry about safety nets. Losers do." Now that habit was bleeding into his business. He funneled company funds into personal luxuries, disguising them as business expenses. He paid influencers to promote his brand, chasing an image instead of profit. He burned cash to feed his ego, and the board grumbled quietly as the numbers slipped. And every time he needed more capital to cover his recklessness, he sold a little more stock. Stock I was ready to buy. First it was small. He didn't even notice. A few thousand shares here, a percentage point there. To him it was pocket change. But to me it was gold. Because each sale brought me closer. By the time he realized I had climbed past 10%, it was too late to push me out. I was in the room now, a voice he couldn't silence, a vote he couldn't ignore. He tried to laugh it off, of course. At a shareholder meeting, he smirked at me across the polished conference table. "I suppose congratulations are in order. Quite the little collection you've made, Madeline. Though let's be honest, you'll never get further than this. You're out of your depth." I smiled back. "We'll see." The board members shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact. Others gave me the faintest nods of encouragement. They were tired of him, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. Not yet. The tipping point came with a failed expansion. He had promised a glittering new branch overseas, hyped it up in interviews, poured millions into flashy advertisements. But he hadn't done the groundwork. He ignored market research, dismissed warnings, and bulldozed through planning. The branch collapsed within months. Contracts fell apart. Investors lost faith. And suddenly the man who loved to gloat looked vulnerable. That's when I moved faster. With the help of allies I had cultivated, I bought up more and more. Every dip in the market became my opportunity. Every time his arrogance cost him, I swooped in. He was so busy patching holes in the sinking ship that he didn't realize I was quietly taking the helm. By the third year after the divorce, I owned nearly 25%. Enough to block him. Enough to terrify him. Enough to finally make him sweat. One night he called me. It was the first time he'd spoken to me directly since the divorce. His voice was sharp, brittle. "What are you doing, Madeline? What's your game?" I leaned back in my chair, smiling. "Just investing. Isn't that what smart people do?" "You think you can take my company?" he snapped. "I built this from nothing. You're nothing without me." My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. "Funny. Because every time you stumble, I grow stronger. Maybe you should worry less about me and more about yourself." The silence on the other end was delicious. Then the click of him hanging up. For once he didn't have a comeback. But arrogance dies hard. Instead of fixing the cracks, he tried to cover them with gold paint. Bigger parties. Flashier cars. A new girlfriend half his age paraded around like a prize. He doubled down on the very habits that were destroying him. And the board was watching. So was I. The final straw came when he tried to buy back control. He called an emergency board meeting, waving around plans for a massive loan that would let him reclaim shares. "I'll show them all," he barked. "This company is mine." But the banks weren't blind. They saw the weak profits, the reckless spending, the collapsing trust. The loan was denied. And I bought even more. By the end of that year I owned 35%. He had started at 100. Now he barely held 40. And the rest? Controlled by people who were very, very tired of him. People who were ready for a change. And I was waiting in the wings. Because soon the boardroom would no longer be his stage. It would be mine. For 3 years I had lived in his shadow. Watching. Waiting. Collecting piece after piece of what he thought was untouchable. Now it was time to step into the light. The boardroom was gleaming that morning. Sunlight bouncing off polished wood. Coffee steaming in porcelain cups. Executives shuffled papers, whispered nervously, glanced at their phones. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that comes before a storm. He walked in late, of course, like always. Tailored suit, confident stride, that smug grin plastered on his face. He thought he owned the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, dropping his briefcase onto the table, "let's get this over with so I can get back to running a company." A few chuckles rose, brittle and forced. He didn't notice. He never noticed. The meeting began as usual. He rattled off numbers, exaggerated successes, glossed over losses. The expansion failure was spun as a strategic reset. Employee turnover was natural evolution. Investors pulling out were seasonal fluctuations. But the board wasn't smiling. And for the first time I saw the shift. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at me. When the floor opened I stood. Calm. Steady. He blinked, then smirked. "Ah, our very own shareholder hobbyist. Madeline, was it? Come to enjoy the show." I smiled. I didn't come to watch. I came to lead. The room went silent. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents. Verified, notarized, indisputable. "I now control 41% of this company," I said. The silence deepened. A chair creaked. Someone gasped. His smile cracked, then wavered, then shattered. He stammered. "That's impossible." "Oh, But the papers didn't lie. 41%. The largest stake in the company. Larger than his. He shot up from his chair, face flushed crimson. You've been plotting this? Since the divorce? This is betrayal." I tilted my head. "Betrayal? You mean like taking everything from me and calling it a win? You celebrated while I was rebuilding. You gloated while I was learning. And while you were busy burning through profits, I was buying pieces of your empire." I leaned forward. "You thought you won. You thought I was finished. But all you did was hand me the blueprint." The board members exchanged glances, whispers rippling around the table. He tried to rally. "This company was built by me. From the ground up. She's just here because she was my wife once. She doesn't know business. She doesn't know leadership. She doesn't know." "Actually," one of the board members interrupted gently, "she does. She's been in every meeting these past 2 years. She listens. She studies. She makes sense when you don't." Another added, "She's earned our trust. You've lost it." The room tilted. And for the first time in his life, my ex-husband didn't have an audience. He had judges. The vote was called. It didn't take long. One by one the board members raised their hands. A motion for new leadership. For restructuring. For me. When the count ended I had the majority. He had nothing. He slammed his fist on the table shouting, "You'll regret this. All of you. She's nothing without me." But no one listened. The man who once strutted through this room like a king now looked like what he truly was. A gambler who had lost the final hand. I gathered my papers calmly, tucked them into my folder and stood. "Thank you," I told the board. "I'll take it from here." Then I turned to him, my voice quiet but sharp as glass. "You thought you won. But today you learned the truth. You only ever played into my hand." His face twisted, A mix of rage and disbelief, but I didn't wait for his reply. I walked out of the boardroom, every step echoing like a drumbeat of victory. Because for the first time the company wasn't his trophy. It was mine. That night I stood by the window of my new office, his old office, and looked out over the city skyline. The lights shimmered like stars, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of peace that only comes when justice is finally served. He thought he had taken everything from me. But all along I had been taking it back. Piece by piece. Until there was nothing left for him. Only for me. The day after the boardroom coup, I arrived at the office before dawn. The building was the same one I had walked into countless times during my marriage. Marble floors, glass doors, the logo etched proudly in steel. But this time it felt different. This time it was mine. I stepped into the executive suite, and for a moment I just stood there. His nameplate had already been taken down. The desk was empty, stripped of his personal trophies and framed photographs. The room didn't echo with his arrogance anymore. It pulsed with possibility. I sank into the chair. His chair, the one he used to brag about being the seat of power. It didn't feel like power when I sat in it. It felt like responsibility. And that was the difference between us. He thought leadership was about control, about domination, about being the loudest voice in the room. I knew now it was about listening. About building. About proving that what you take care of thrives and what you neglect crumbles. The first weeks were a blur. Meetings, restructures, late nights. But unlike him, I didn't hide behind empty promises. I asked questions. I listened to employees. I brought back people he had driven away with his temper and arrogance. And slowly the atmosphere shifted. Where there had been fear, there was now trust. Where there had been chaos, there was order. And where there had been ego, there was vision. But it wasn't just about the company. It was about me. For years I had lived under his shadow. He told me I wasn't enough. That I couldn't understand business. That I was weak, incapable, small. And for a long time I believed him. Until the day I didn't. Until the day I realized that the greatest victory isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right. I never gloated publicly. I didn't post photos of champagne bottles or smug captions about winning. I didn't need to. Because true victory doesn't require an audience. It requires peace. And I had it. Occasionally I would hear his name. Whispers of his failed ventures, of doors closing on him in the business world, of investors who wouldn't take his calls anymore. He had burned too many bridges, cashed in too much arrogance, and when it was gone he had nothing left. But I didn't dwell on him. He had chosen his path. And I had chosen mine. The sweetest revenge wasn't watching him fall. It was watching myself rise. It was sitting at the helm of the company we once dreamed of building together, steering it toward a future I had envisioned all along. It was hearing employees laugh in the hallways again, seeing clients return, watching numbers climb not because of flash but because of substance. It was realizing that what he tried to destroy in me had only made me stronger. Months later, I stood on the balcony of my office during a celebration of the company's turnaround. The skyline glittered, music floated through the air, and for the first time the applause wasn't for him. It was for me. I raised my glass not to gloat but to remind myself of the journey. I had been discarded, humiliated, underestimated. But I had turned pain into power, loss into leverage, and betrayal into triumph. And as the cheers rose around me, I whispered the words that had fueled me from the very beginning. You thought you won. I smiled. But I never stopped playing. And that's when I understood the truth. Winning isn't about who takes the first trophy. It's about who holds the last one. And this time it wasn't him. It was me.